Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of this podcast is either an interview with a guest or multiple guests or a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship in relation to computer science education. In this week's particular episode, I'm unpacking a paper titled Project moveSMART, When Physical Education Meets Computational Thinking in Elementary Classrooms. This paper was written by Fritz, Dylan Bray, Grace Lee, Christine Julien, Sherry Burson, Darla Castelli, Carol Ramsey, and Jamie Payton. Apologies if I mispronounce any names. Here's the abstract for this particular paper. Quote, although computing skills are increasingly required for success in high school, college, and beyond, there's little emphasis on improving computational thinking in elementary curricula. Computer science pathways that do exist often fail to engage students' populations that are traditionally underserved. Project moveSMART uses a web-based platform to integrate opportunities for physical education with computer science and computational thinking. CSCT, learning activities. Project moveSMART was developed through a researcher-practitioner partnership involving computer scientists, educational researchers, and teachers. This article describes a series of tutorials from Project moveSMART designed to introduce elementary students to CSCT by making connections to physical activity and grade-level curricula in other subjects. Through these tutorials, students create a physical activity monitor using the BBC microbit. Fourth grade students that underwent a single-day intervention experienced a significant improvement in their interest in coding and in their perceptions of coders. End quote. If I were to summarize this paper into a single sentence, I would say that this article summarizes pilot study findings and activities that integrate CS and CT with physical education through a microbit. Now, as always in the show notes, I include a direct link to this particular paper, which is found for free on Google Scholar. And if you click the author last names, it'll actually send you to their Google Scholar profiles so you can read more papers by the authors. And you can find those show notes by clicking the link in the app that you're listening to this on, or by visiting jaredoleary.com and clicking on the podcast tab. And while you're there, you'll find hundreds, if not thousands, of free computer science education resources, as well as a bunch of drumming and gaming content, because I do stream and I am a content creator at heart, professionally and for leisure. And while you're at it, if you're looking for more free computer science education resources, make sure you check out bootuppd.org, which is the nonprofit that I work for and that powers this podcast. All right, so in the introduction of this paper, the authors begin by discussing how there are different inequalities in terms of different demographics receiving more or less access to computer science and computational thinking instruction and experience time, and how this is also the case for physical education as well. For example, here's a quote from page 2. Quote, despite the benefits of physical activity, 80% of adolescents fail to meet the recommended hour of daily physical activity, end quote. So the author cites some studies that say that elementary school is the best place to help develop habits of physical activity that will carry over into the later grades and later on in life. So in order to address these gaps in both of these subject areas, I decided to combine physical education with computer science education through Project moveSMART. So here's a quote from page 2 that kind of discusses this. Quote, Project moveSMART is a collaborative educational game built around a researcher-practitioner partnership, RPP, that includes teachers from multiple schools and school districts. Project moveSMART promotes increased physical activity and CS and CT, while also delivering content that aligns with state learning standards. In many cases, these three facets are integrated into the same content. For instance, in one learning activity, students program their own step counter, measure their steps as they complete a physical activity, then finish an assessment that includes questions involving inequalities, a topic covered in state learning standards. Project moveSMART also promotes physical activity through the online platform used to deliver educational content, as students increase their class's score by logging higher rates of physical activity, end quote. So the next section of this paper is on related work, so I highly recommend checking it out if you're interested in reading more about some different studies that talk about similar things. Then the third section is titled The Pilot Study. So in this section, they talk about the demographics of the students, like where they are located, and discusses how the participants were from 4th and 5th grade classes. And then it gives an outline of the platform that is being used. So it's basically an online platform where students are able to kind of log their activities, go through some lessons and instructional content, like in MakeCode, where they can learn how to program their microbits, and then submit their assignments and whatnot, and like daily activities and data, etc. Now, these lessons are scaffolded from simple to more complex, where they reveal different aspects, concepts, practices, etc. over time. So starting on page 5 is kind of like a little explanation of each one of the different learning experiences. So for example, the very first one is a walkthrough to show you how to create a timer with microbit. So you might use a timer to figure out how fast you can run, or reaction time or something. The second learning activity or experience is all about sensing. So this is about using an accelerometer to create a step counter with the microbit. Then the third one focuses on variables, so refactoring and iterative development and whatnot. So they'll go back to a previous project, add some variables into it. Then the fourth activity is all about control flow. So they're going to create or modify a step counter that has an on and off button. So using an if conditional to create that on and off button. Then in the fifth activity, students are going to modify their program to include a step rate. So how many steps you take per unit of time, like how many steps are you taking per minute or per hour or whatever. In the sixth activity, they get into some complex conditionals. So instead of just if, they might have if else conditionals. So then they can compare something like the step rate and the intensity of an activity level and use that data to inform like how well they think they're exercising or whatever. And then the seventh activity is all about communication. So using the broadcast or the radio to be able to communicate through RFID from a microbit to the class's Raspberry Pi. So that way they can like check in. Now, I just very quickly went over all the activities. It's almost like, 3 pages worth of content. So if you want to learn more about, well, what did they actually do in this? And like, what are some example questions and whatnot? Make sure you check out those pages starting on page 5. All right, so the next section on page 8 is titled Physical Activity and CS Interest. So unfortunately, COVID had an impact on this particular pilot study. So it made it so that only 9 of the 4th grade students were in attendance in person, and most of the 4th grade students were able to complete the first 2 learning activities. However, the 5th grade students, at least most of them, only completed the first one, and none of them completed any of the other activities. So that means for the results for this particular study, for the 5th graders, they only created a microbit timer. And then for the 4th graders, they created a microbit timer and then a step counter. So here's a quote from page 8 that kind of summarizes 2 main findings. Quote, "We made the following observations. 1, even a short intervention using the microbit-based learning activities has the potential to improve students' coding attitudes. And 2, incremental deployment of features helped maintain engagement," end quote. Okay, so if we look at the data, which has statistical significance, but not necessarily like huge gains, we can see an increase for the 4th graders in coding confidence, coding interest, coding utility, social value of coding, and perceptions of coders. Some of these are relatively small, but it appears as though the coding confidence and perceptions of coders are statistically significant. Now, when you compare this with the 5th graders, there's really not much change, like very small amount of increase in coding confidence. There's actually a decrease in coding interest, which is interesting. The coding utility remained about the same. There is an increase in social value of coding. That was the largest increase. And then there's a slight decrease in perceptions of coders. So those are interesting findings. Now, here's a quote from page 9 that kind of elaborates on why that might be for the 5th graders. Quote, "There were no statistically significant changes for the 5th grade students' coding attitudes, but a large portion of the 5th grade class period was spent introducing moveSMART. So many students did not make significant progress through the learning activities. Because the 4th grade students had been more engaged with the platform throughout the year, they were able to make greater progress because they had less trouble logging into and navigating through the platform. This highlights the importance of incrementally introducing platform features," end quote. Yeah, and that's something that I totally agree with. It's like the studies on testing demonstrate that the more you practice taking the test, the higher you're going to score, because you're going to be more familiar with it, especially if it's an online platform, etc. Which reminds me of like TPACK, which is a framework that stands for technological knowledge, pedagogical knowledge, and content knowledge. And so if you think of like a Venn diagram of 3 circles all kind of intersecting with each other, in this case, you need to think of how to teach the lessons. That's the pedagogical knowledge. You need to know the content knowledge in 2 different subject areas. So that's the content knowledge. And then the technological knowledge is you need to know how to introduce the platform, so getting kids comfortable with it. So from a user standpoint, like students not only need to understand the content knowledge that they are learning, but also the platforms they're using to demonstrate their understanding, or to even just learn, like to be able to figure out, how do I log in and watch these videos and whatnot? And that's something that I often see a lot of new like technology and CS teachers not really understand, especially when you get into like the primary grades. Like kids don't know how to log into devices. You often have to teach them how to do that. It's just one of those things that like is so commonplace for adults, most adults, that we often forget about having to teach the technology. Like, here's what a left click is. Here's what a right click is. There's the same thing for, here's how to navigate through this website. On the left-hand side is your menu tree. On the right-hand side is what you're going to learn, etc. So there are ways to do that that are interesting, and there are ways to do that that are not. And that's where the pedagogical knowledge comes into play, etc. All right, but here's one more quote that I want to read from page 9. Quote, "One teacher, a physical education teacher, told us, initially, I thought computer science in elementary school, it doesn't matter. After watching the students do it, I was fascinated with how much they love this activity. They initially didn't think they were capable of doing it. They had so much fun, this opened their minds to doing computer science, and they really believed in themselves. End quote. That's a great quote. I do, however, wonder how much of that is selection bias and maybe not reading off quotes of hey, I hated this. And that's not an accusation made at the authors or anything. I just know that there is a tendency for some researchers to promote this. Hey, here's this wonderful thing that we've created. You should do it too. We're going to ignore all the data that says it's not wonderful. They're outliers. Ignore them. But that's just me being a critical skeptic of all research. All right, so I know this is a relatively short paper, so a relatively short podcast, but at the end of these, like to talk about my lingering thoughts and questions. I actually have a few for this one. These questions are not meant as critiques of the paper or of the authors or anything like that. This is just me sharing my thoughts that I had while I was reading through this to hopefully spark some discussion with others in the field. So if you hear a question on here and you're like, oh, I want to talk with Jared about that, join me on a podcast. There's a contact me button on my website, jaredoleary.com. Just let me know. Here's the first question that I have. How much of the jump in interest is due to the novelty having not worn off yet? So the fourth graders had 2 lessons and the fifth graders only had 1 lesson. What would have happened if they went through all 7 lessons or 20 lessons? How would the interest change over time? So if you were to do a test beforehand and then after every single one of the lessons, would it look like a bell curve of interest where it starts off not very interested, gains some interest, and then plateaus, and then eventually students start to lose interest? We don't know because of the length of this particular study, and we also don't know what happens with that because most do pre and post only and not any kind of midterm assessments. But I ask this because I had experience where the district that I previously worked in basically gave me everything that they wanted to test out in a makerspace, and they just let my classes try it out. So I had a middle school makerspace, and we'd get every robot, every device, etc. that the district wanted to see, hey, should we give this to other schools? And students often, for most things, would think it was really cool for a week or two, and then they lose interest in it. It was only the stuff that students consistently wanted to engage with throughout the quarter and semester that I was like, hey, I highly recommend buying more of these things. So for example, the makey in my coding classes, kids had a dozen or so that they could pick up, use some Play-Doh, use some aluminum foil, some conductive thread, wires, etc. to create things that they would use in their Scratch projects or whatever. Students loved it for about 2 weeks, and then they got bored with it. And then they realized it was too much of a hassle, or they just prefer to just code their projects. So what I don't know is, with a study like this, that's on the intersections of CS and physical education, at what point does the novelty wear off? But speaking of that intersection of CS and physical education, the fact that we are having to find ways to combine subject areas together just to meet the minimum recommended daily amounts is an indicator that we have too many subject requirements and not enough time in the school day to learn them. So when might this approach be a disservice to everybody? In other words, when might this approach diminish both subject areas by forcing people to focus on the intersections of each subject area and not the other areas outside of those intersections? So for example, there are many interesting intersections with music and CS. I've done podcasts on them. I'll include a link to them in the episode, as well as some publications that I've done on that intersection. But what about areas specific to each domain, like the stress relief that can come with playing the drums, or the affordances and constraints of different sorting techniques? These are beneficial and interesting on their own, but they don't necessarily intersect well with each other. I would not be interested in learning how to sort my drums. That makes no sense. So at what point are we putting on blinders to everything that doesn't align well with such an intersection? Often, when I see these intersections of 2 different subject areas, it's in short activities, maybe a unit, if we're lucky. But then after that, the ideas are repetitive or just non-existent. So there's only so much we can do at the intersections of different subject areas, but it still gets at the heart of the issue of, I think we have too many required subject areas. The fact that 80% of students are not getting the recommended daily amount of physical education of 1 hour is setting up for a potential lifetime of physical and mental health problems. And that's alarming. But then we have recommended daily amounts for other subject areas, like math and reading. I think reading is 90 minutes in my school. And if we keep piling on all these recommended amounts, hey, this is really beneficial for you, eventually we're going to run out of enough time in the week to do it. So while these intersections can help to make it so you can do both at the same time, it also makes it so that we are ignoring everything else that's interesting in those subject areas, but it also just doesn't address the larger issue of we have too many required subject areas, in my opinion. But I know that's controversial. And again, you can come on this podcast and disagree with me. I'm happy to chat. Last question that I got from reading this particular paper is, how might we explore integrated CS curricula through an interest-driven approach? So there's a bunch of other episodes where I talk about this. I'll include a link to some of those episodes in the show notes. For example, the interview with Mitch Resnick, where we talk about why it's important to use an interest-driven approach in mandatory CS classes where we cannot assume buy-in from everyone forced to attend. Now, I ask this question because a lot of the integrated curricula that I see is very focused. It's everybody's doing the same thing and creating the same thing. And this can create some problems in that kids who don't have an interest in that particular activity might lose interest in both subject areas. But if you instead take an approach like a rhizomatic approach or an interest-driven approach, again, links in the show notes that talk about those, then when a student is forced to be in this class that explores these intersections, maybe they will develop an interest in those subject areas because they're exploring something they're already inherently interested in that just so happens to include CS and something else. But we need more studies on that, so stay tuned. Anyways, I know this was a shorter episode, but I thought it was a really interesting idea. I was like, ooh, physical education and CS, let's learn more. So hopefully more studies will come out in the future that aren't just pilot studies that are negatively impacted by COVID. But thank you so much for listening to this episode. Stay tuned next week for another episode. And until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.